The following video is a reflection of my current knowledge and understanding in this domain of goaltending. Information is subject to change and be updated in light of new evidence and understanding. In the 2018-2019 NHL season, there were 153 shutouts. A shutout for a goalie typically represents a perfect game in terms of outcome and is something goalies like to strive for. It'll always lead to an improvement in stats, and it means you get to celebrate a win or at the very least a tie. But is this idea of a perfect game something to keep in mind during training and development? In other words, should goalies be perfectionists, and is there a place for perfectionism in goaltending? When it was all said and done, I came up with a very unsatisfying answer to the question of should goaltenders be perfectionists? The answer is yes. And no. That being said, I did find some useful information along the way that relates to perfectionism and skill development. While each of the articles I read examined a different hypothesis, there were some common threads among each of them that closely parallels goaltender development. Two prominent theories kept emerging in the research. The first is called TwoFactor Theory. The second, Perfectionism Acceptance Theory. While more recent research seems to more closely support Perfectionism Acceptance Theory, there are elements of Two-Factor Theory that have strong empirical support that are relevant to goaltenders, which I'll discuss. According to Two-Factor Theory, perfectionism can be both adaptive and maladaptive. Let me create two different goalies to explain how. Goaltender A and goaltender B both consider themselves perfectionists. They're the same height, same weight, they score exactly the same on fitness tests, and they play with a similar style on similar teams. Goaltender A is what's known as a perfectionistic striver, and goaltender B a perfectionistic concerner. Now pay attention to the traits and see if you identify with one more than the other. Goaltender A sets high performance standards and has a high self-oriented striving for mastery. Goalie A will report high satisfaction with progress and shows an approach mindset, meaning there's a goal they continually strive for. They're metaphorically running towards something. There are plenty of failures though, but because of the higher conscientiousness, positive affect, and active coping skills, moments of failure aren't much more than short periods of disappointment followed by honest reflection and adjustment, and a continuation of goal striving. Goaltender B also sets high performance standards. There are plenty of successes along the way, yet there's an accompanying feeling of never feeling satisfied. Goalie B carries an avoidance mindset in training and performance, meaning they strive to avoid doing worse than they've done previously, as well as striving to just avoid doing worse than others. Similar to goalie A, there are plenty of failures too, but other than seeing a failure or even a small mistake as a minor disappointment, goalie B appears to be completely devastated. Goalie B enters each performance with a great fear of negative social evaluation, large negative reactions to imperfection, and experiences a large discrepancy between expectations and actual performance. Goalie B is also starting to report feelings of burnout, which could largely be due to running hot all the time with reactions to imperfection and a constant battle between unrealistically high personal standards and actual performance results. Goalie B will experience more negative affect and more neurotic behaviors than his counterpart. Goalies like our concerner might get a taste of high-performance hockey based on talent or potential, but those previously listed maladaptive traits tend not to be sustainable at higher levels of competition, so these traits tend to be removed from the environment in one of two ways. The athlete reflects and removes the maladaptive traits from their game on their own, or, after some time, the game itself removes the athletes from that level by way of competition from more adaptive athletes coming up from below. A psychologist named D.E. Hamachek came to a similar conclusion but with slightly different names. He called them Type 1 perfectionists, which are your strivers that will report satisfaction with progress, high personal standards, and a high level of organization. Your Type 2 perfectionists are your maladaptive concerners, whose standards are usually socially prescribed, display a huge concern over mistakes, are never satisfied with progress, have a lot of doubts about their actions, and usually deal with a lot of parental criticism and high parental expectations. Something important to note between the two types of perfectionists is that they've both got high standards set for themselves. The big difference is the type 1 adaptives, while giving a painstaking effort, will still allow themselves to be less than perfect as the situation permits. A group of psychologists looked at perfectionism and goal setting in aspiring Finnish hockey players at the U16 level and found a similar dichotomy with perfectionistic strivings and concerns. They used an existing 2x2 framework by Elliott and McGregor in 2001 to investigate 4 types of achievement goals athletes typically pursue. The first is mastery approach. It's where the athlete strives to master a task. The second is performance approach, where the athlete strives only to do better than others. 3 is mastery avoidance. It's where the athletes only strive to avoid doing worse than they've done before. And 4 is performance avoidance. It's where the athlete strives only to avoid doing worse than others. Their study found that, as expected, with young aspiring athletes invited to a national training camp, most participants reported high levels of mastery approach goals. The avoidance-oriented athletes displayed a greater fear of failure, which often led to less motivation. The mastery approach athletes are the perfectionistic strivers, but these strivings can actually become maladaptive. This happens when striving for perfection turns into a demand for perfection, and we start to see an inability to accept being less than perfect. Likewise, strivings become maladaptive when self-worth is made contingent on achieving perfection, and when non-achievement of perfection is followed by self-criticism. Hockey is a game where goals are supposed to be scored, and when you do get scored on, it's not because something is personally wrong with you, it's because you're a participant in the game operating as it's intended to. Make your pursuit of perfection independent of your self-worth, so that when the mask comes off, even after the worst game of your life, you still know you have a meaningful existence outside the arena. Goal setting is so important to development. Something that comes to mind every time I see perfectionistic striving is that the wording inherently suggests intent behind what you're doing. There's a big difference between hoping something will happen and intending something to happen. Intent means that you have a plan. Hope means you're a function of fortune. Intent also puts you in a better place to deal with setbacks or failure. Because of your plan and your goals, a failure remains nothing more than a minor disappointment and an opportunity to learn rather than an utterly devastating experience, and motivation and discipline should remain intact. At this point in my research, it was becoming very clear that the avoidance mindset with regards to perfectionism was so maladaptive and not ideal for optimal development. So I turned my focus there to examine why that was. An article by Slade and Owens in 1998 examining dual process models defined perfectionism as demanding of oneself or others a higher quality of performance than is required by the situation. Of course, I'd say that there's a balance between conducting yourself as a professional, like taking pride in your work and being attentive to details, and going too far with perfectionistic concerns. It comes down to a concept called your zone of proximal development. This is first developed by psychologist Lev Vygotsky. If you want to just feel good about yourself and your performance during your training, then make your training easy and at or below your current skill level to get the outcome that you want. But if you want to develop, just know and be ready to accept that your performance is inherently going to suffer as you build your skills or address an area of weakness. You won't likely get the outcome you want during the training, but you'll get the development that you need. This is where avoidance starts to enter the picture because you'll typically do more to avoid pain than you will to gain pleasure. This is a problem when it comes to development, as you may be more reluctant to train in your zone of proximal development, since it means there will be some discomfort and frustration, which is avoided easily enough by working on something easier and within your comfort zone. This is then accompanied by the mind games, where you might convince yourself that just because you spent an hour on the ice in your gear, that you're somehow entitled to some improvement. Another problem with the avoidance mindset in goaltender development has to do with something called the ironic process theory. If I told you to do everything you can to avoid thinking about an elephant, how would you do this? One of the traps many people fall into is repeatedly telling themselves, don't think about it, don't think about it, don't think about it. But in order for this to theoretically work, you have to attend to the very thing you don't want to attend to in order to avoid attending to it. That's where the name ironic process comes from. When goalies start thinking in terms of avoidance, like I prevent goals, don't let the next shot in, don't miss it with the glove, don't flinch, don't let out a bad rebound, and so on, our nervous systems do a really good job at programming for actions, which in that case were letting in goals, let the next shot in, miss it with the glove, flinch, give out a bad rebound, because we invest energy in attending to it with the hope that we'll somehow avoid it, regardless if it's prefaced with don't do it. When the pressure is on in the big moments, you want to be the goalie thinking make the save rather than don't let in the goal. Strive to get as close as possible to your ideal self through wording and self-talk rather than getting as far away as possible from your feared self. In a video about athletes and perfectionism, I had to examine the involvement of parents and coaches. Often there's a socially created fear of anything less than the best, thus people are valued for their achievements rather than their character. And in competitive sport, I get it. However, this can be a problem when the focus is on development rather than performance. Psychologist Thomas Greenspan published an article titled "Is There an Antidote to Perfectionism?" and his findings are encouraging. Greenspan notes that perfectionism isn't a fixed psychological entity, but rather a dynamic property of a perfectionistic person's ongoing relational system. It arises when a feeling of personal acceptance is experienced as contingent on performance. Likewise, just as perfectionism appears to be a malleable trait, there are different subscales of perfectionism that contribute to whether or not it's likely to be a problem. A 2007 paper by researchers Lund, Sabanucci, and Wangby highlighted 6 subscales of perfectionism, subscales initially proposed by Frost and colleagues in 1990, that have shown to be a reliable measure of perfectionistic traits as adaptive or maladaptive. The 6 subscales are personal standards, concern over mistakes, doubts about actions, parental expectations, parental criticism, and organization. To the surprise of almost no one, concern over mistakes, doubts about actions, parental expectations, and parental concerns were generally more maladaptive as they showed a positive correlation with anxiety and depression, where personal standards and organization had no anxiety and depression correlation. Having high personal standards can be a good thing, but only when it's combined with an acceptance of non-perfection. According to the Frost subscales, one of the most maladaptive combinations for perfectionism is concern over mistakes, doubts about actions, parental criticism, and parental expectations. On the flip side, the subscales of personal standards and organization were actually loaded on the adaptive factor of perfectionism. Lund in 2004 states that in accordance with perfection acceptance theory, personal standards are adaptive when combined with the acceptance of non-perfection, but those same personal standards become maladaptive when combined with an inability to accept failures, mistakes, and shortcomings. Adaptive perfectionism means to set high standards for yourself, derive a real sense of pleasure from giving a painstaking effort, yet to feel free to be less precise as the situation permits. So what does all this mean for goalies? Being a neurotic perfectionist is not a sustainable business model to keep you at a high level of hockey. Hockey is a game where goals are supposed to be scored. There's a certain level of acceptance that has to come with being a goaltender, and with that acceptance should be a strategy to move on and regroup so that one goal doesn't become 2 and then 3 and so on. Your individual self-worth cannot be contingent on meeting your athletic personal standards. Keep negative reactions at bay. There's a reason emergency personnel are called first responders and not first reactors. The world is already full of people having a reaction to something, which is something anyone can do and that doesn't help the situation. Elite performers will have a response instead of an emotional reaction. Finally, for parents and coaches dealing with perfectionist athletes, be very careful the athlete doesn't link performance or achievement with self-worth. Find that separation. Build an environment of acceptance. Personal standards from the athlete must still exist, but allow for mistakes followed by self-reflection to correct thoughts like, Less than perfect must mean something is wrong with me. And the last point, yes, I'm gonna go there. Parents, please be mindful of that car ride home. For some of you, it might just mean you need to just shut up and talk about something totally unrelated after a poor performance. Let the coaches coach, do your job as a parent. Remember from earlier, parental expectations and parental criticism are positively correlated to anxiety and depression, so don't fuel that fire. Just as it's important for your athlete to respond rather than to react, it's important that you as the parent or the coach do the same just to demonstrate how this is done. It's safe to say the research took me in a bit of a different direction than I had anticipated with regards to perfectionism in athletes, but I hope this research proved helpful in some way. A full list of references can be found in the description, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to connect. Remember to stay out of your own way, and thanks for watching.